Hey, everybody. Thanks for taking a few minutes to watch this video. I know it's mandatory. We all have to do it, but somehow it just makes me think that you care. So thanks for taking a few minutes to watch this. The paper that I wrote was on inclusive teaching in the church, how we might make our discipleship and teaching efforts available to as many people as possible. And this was a really interesting project for me to undertake. I really felt like I learned quite a few things. So I just want to jump into a few of those, and hopefully it'll lead us to some good discussion next week in class. So one of the, kind of as a way of introduction, the place that I started with this was that we as the church have this mandate, this calling that's really summarized well in the Great Commission, which is that we are to go and make disciples, and we're supposed to make them all over the place, all people, all nations, all of that kind of language. And I think because we as the church have felt that's our mission, then we have invested quite a bit into teaching. We've invested in training teachers. We've invested in resources for these teachers, and just trying to figure out how we can teach well to educate people in the way of Jesus. And I think that's a really noble goal. The mistake that I think we have made, or maybe the part that we've kind of skipped over in our efforts to create great teaching, is that the goal of education isn't actually teaching. The goal of education is learning. And in all of our efforts to prioritize the teacher, I think it's possible that we've not asked the question, who are we trying to teach, or what's going on with them, and what do they need to be able to learn well? So the result of this has been that we've really over-prioritized the qualifications of the teacher, which I think are important, substantiated of course, in Paul's writings to Timothy and Titus. But while that's important, I think we've over-prioritized it at the expense of our audience. So in other words, we've ended up being a group of people who know the truth without knowing the audience. And I think the result of that is that we've ended up with teaching without learning. So with that kind of as my premise, what I set out to do was try to understand what this inclusive teaching actually looks like, and then what are the reasons that we can't get there? What are some of the challenges to it? And then just some subtle kind of shifts that we might make to be a little bit more inclusive in our teaching. And to understand the kind of basis and the foundations for inclusive teaching, my research led me into the educational realm, where there's been great strides that have been made in this idea, which really is the goal of inclusive teaching, I should say, is that every student would feel valued and given equal access to learning. So it's not as much that we're just focused on the content of what we're teaching, but we're also really focused on the environment that's being created, and we're really focused on the student or the learner themselves. What's going on with this person? Where are they coming from? How do they learn? What are their goals, and what are they trying to do? So it's really a decision that we're no longer going to ignore cultural dimensions, sociocultural identities, any of those things, because we understand that those things are a part of this, and our desire to teach people can't ignore those things and kind of create this almost development on demand kind of mentality where people just grow. So we have to understand the learner as opposed to just simply teaching the required material. So one good example of this that you might be familiar with is what is known as the 3 domains of learning, Bloom's taxonomy of learning, which really addressed in these 3 domains just the understanding that kind of over a period of about 15 years or so, that learning took place cognitively, this mental aspect, but there was also an affect to it, or an affective emotional side, and then a psychomotor reality. And really what Bloom and his colleagues understood and argued for was that all three of these categories had to be learned, used, and utilized and understood in the planning of lessons and the creating of curriculum, and all of these things. So this is just one example of a way that inclusive teaching has really been implemented in mainstream education. I had breakfast this morning with a principal of our local elementary school, and he was just reminding me again that this stuff is now becoming more and more just standard practice in the educational arena, and a lot of that it really is attributed to advances in neuroscience, the understanding of the brain and its function, so that educators are more and more now asking the question, what's happening inside of our students' heads? What's going on there that's either creating the right situation, or right atmosphere, or right conditions for learning, what other things are going on that maybe are taking away from that. And there have been some real, in the educational side and in the academic kind of secular education, there have been some real important learnings from that. And a lot of this I got from Jensen and brain-based learning, and also Sousa in his work about how we learn. So just a couple examples. Understanding that every time that learning takes place, the brain goes through actual chemical and physical changes. One that was very surprising to me is that reading is the most difficult task that we give to the brain. That music creates real educational advantages for students. That classrooms can be really difficult environments because there are many personalities. They're all crammed into a combined space and expected to interact according to kind of an established set of rules and emotional behavior. That's really hard for people. Jensen pointing out that hand movement is actually very useful for the brain and really helps in learning. So there's all of these things that have been figured out educationally, and the impact of all of this has been really important. Teachers are connecting with wider ranges of students. Students are more comfortable voicing opinions. Some of the limitations and barriers that have been set before, we're seeing those pushed through. And as teachers have learned to employ different teaching based on different learning styles and based on what we're learning about the brain, the experience of the learner has improved overall. So as I realized how far how far education had come in understanding these things, how far kind of that educational discipline, schools, and people who are working with children had come, it led me to the question: well, why is the church not there yet? Why is the church so far behind? And so as I looked at these two things, the education system, the church, I tried to figure out, well, what bridges this gap? What helps us take what's true about the education system and apply it to the church? And that led me to a question about the Bible, which was basically, do we see this anywhere? Is there anywhere in Scripture that we see these ideas of inclusive teaching? And as I went back and looked, I found quite a few places, starting, of course, with Jesus, widely considered to be one of the great teachers of all time. He was very inclusive in his teaching. He didn't treat every person the same way. He took into consideration backgrounds, motives, and personalities. So, for example, when a rich ruler comes to Jesus in Mark 10, Jesus is very direct with him. But when a woman is caught in adultery in John chapter 8 and brought before Jesus, he's very gentle with her. When Nicodemus came at night, Jesus engaged him academically with a discussion. When Zacchaeus climbed a tree to look for Jesus, Jesus engaged him intimately in an emotional way rather than a cognitive way, calling him down and having a meal with him. But perhaps the best example of Jesus' inclusive teaching is found with his disciples. Miracles like the great catch of fish that we find in both Luke 5, and John 21, both show that Jesus had this deep connection to the cultural context of the people he was trying to teach. He used miracles that would connect with some of these disciples who had been fishermen for their entire life. On the Mount of Olives, when Jesus is teaching in Matthew 24, he uses cognitive learning styles to connect with his disciples. But when he is sitting with Peter around a campfire one morning, and he says, "Peter, do you love me?" And he asks him 3 times. That's a great example of of affect being put in, an emotionally based learning. And then when you consider psychomotor or physical learning, Jesus demonstrates that as well. He washes the disciples' feet in John 13. He reveals himself to Thomas and says, what? He doesn't say, just hear what I have to say, or he says, touch my hands, put your hand in the hole in my side. These are great examples of Jesus using multiple learning styles and inclusive learning. You also see it in his parables and his other teachings. His parables are a great example of these narrative stories, but then passages such as the Beatitudes, the discourse on the vine and the branches, you see these metaphors. It just seems as if Jesus considered the needs of his listeners and then adjusted his teaching accordingly as a result of that. Then also in the book of Acts, we see this same thing carried forward, a very inclusive kind of style of ministry. We're told that new believers devoted themselves to teaching. It's a very cognitive function, to fellowship together, emotion, and then to sharing of possessions, a physical act. In Acts chapter 10, God calls Peter to inclusive teaching when he sends him away from the Jewish people and tells him to visit Cornelius and the disciples with the good news. So the more that I looked at Scripture, I realized that while the education system and some of the psychology that's behind that has certainly taken great steps forward and provided models and truths that the church can learn from, the educational system isn't where this all started. All of this started with the Scripture, ultimately, with a God who was inclusive in the way that he showed up here. Incarnation is one of the most inclusive teaching styles that has ever been seen in the world. So I really felt that the Scripture set a great model, that education then moved forward, that now the church can adapt and adopt. So that led me in my paper to the question of what barriers are facing this idea of inclusive teaching, which just said in plain terms, if this is so clearly effective, and if this makes such a difference, and if we as the church feel like we've been given this mission to disciple, then why are we not doing these things? Why is every church on the planet not inclusive in their teaching style, not paying attention to these brain-based strategies? And I think there's a number of reasons for this. And I'll just point out a few of the ones that I used in my paper. But the first thing I'd say is just the teachers themselves. I think the biggest barrier to inclusive teaching is actually the teachers. For people my age and above, we were trained in a very left-brained, cognitive, systematic way of communicating. 3 points, outlines, linear, all of that. And I think the new research that's available represents a really, really steep learning curve. So I think for some people, we just straight up don't want to do it. It's too much work. But then even for those of us that do want to do it, I think for a lot of teachers, there's just not access to the training or resources needed. I mean, I would say for myself that going into this course, I'd read some stuff on neuroscience and brain-based learning, but I've learned so much during this class that's changing the way that I teach. And I just think for a lot of people, that information's not available to them, especially when we think outside of the pastor category. So for people who are senior pastors, maybe they have a budget, the ability to read and go to conferences. But what about the Sunday school teachers? What about the small group leaders? All of just the faithful lay people who don't have access to this. So I think teachers that are not trained can be a real barrier for this. I think another barrier is curriculum. In the children's ministry arena and somewhat in the youth ministry arena, we've seen great strides in this. Our kids' curriculum now starts to mirror brain-based strategies, and most of the very popular or well-known mainstream kids' curriculum is starting to do this. And in youth ministry, you see some of it, but beyond that, most of what we're doing is kind of self-made. I think generally across the board, we're not using a ton of curriculum for adults, and because of that, a lot of our curriculum really does not do this. It's strictly cognitive. And I talked to a friend who's a publisher of curriculum, and he said the adult stuff that we're trying that implements these brain-based strategies like universal design for learning or those kind of things, it's just not gaining real wide traction in the church. It said another way, people just aren't using it because it's too different. Another, I think, roadblock or barrier is facilities. Most of our churches are not designed to facilitate anything other than lecture-based cognitive learning. I mean, if you think about, and I think Shane Hipps in his book Flickering Pixels was the one who gets credit for this. But even when you look at our churches, it is 2 sections oftentimes with a row down the middle. It mirrors a book, left to right, 2 columns, top to bottom. So we've really set up our spaces even for cognitive linear learning, with the exception probably of our kids' classrooms and some of our youth spaces. So that means that if you're a church or you're part of a church that wants to make some of these changes, oftentimes you can't even make them because you're limited by space. Another barrier would be the learners themselves. I think in a lot of instances, people are just familiar with what they're familiar with. They're comfortable with certain things. People who've been in church a long time, they like things a certain way, and they're probably the ones who would complain if we tried to do something different. So I think sometimes our new efforts to reach out to new people are not met with excitement by the people who were, kind of our first audiences and our first listeners. So I think that's at least an important thing to keep in mind. Also, in addition, some people just don't know how to learn this way. If you are only used to learning one way, and then in the church we start bringing in other styles, sometimes that can be similar to learning a new language. So it can just be a really difficult thing. Another barrier, I think, is just our tradition and our past successes. I think we've seen God move in specific ways. If you go back to, the industrial, the revolutions, if you go back to the agricultural age, like all the way moving forward for us, we have seen the world operate with this linear fashion. This kind of linear learning, cognitive learning. And I think we've seen some success in that throughout our church history. So it's really easy to look at specific movements that were cognitively driven and think of those movements as kind of lightning in a bottle, which could create some fear, some apprehension for trying anything new. And you would think this would probably only be an issue for maybe mainstream churches or older churches, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think even younger, more progressive churches can get stuck in their own successes and not want to make attempts to change anything. Another thing that I think can potentially be a barrier is kind of the area of our strategic planning, our mission, our vision, and how we resource those things. Most churches have a very clear mission set up and then a strategic plan or a strategy that implements that mission. And then our budgets are built around that strategy. So if you have not taken this kind of concept of brain-based learning or of inclusive teaching and built it into your mission, your strategies, and then how you spend your money, that can be a really massive shift for people. Because in order to train pastors to teach differently or to train teachers, you're going to have to spend some money. Resources are going to have to be allocated in order for people to be able to do this. So I think for some places, just the fact that they would have to really step back, break apart the thing that they have already set up, and then do something different. I think for some people, it's just too much work to do. So those just represent a few of the barriers that I think stand in our way sometimes. But even with those barriers mentioned, I think the reward is well worth the risk and the effort that we take, because we have a real opportunity to reach out to more people and to teach people in a way that they can actually understand and grasp and internalize the gospel for themselves. So I think in order to fulfill the calling that we've been given through the Great Commission and to overcome these barriers, we just have to make some strategic shifts in the ways that we teach. And I really want to focus for a second on the word shift here, because some of the things I'm going to mention, if taken to an extreme by themselves, would not be healthy. So I don't think we need to take the pendulum from a cognitive side, for example, and move it all the way over to where we're only feelings based and creative. I don't think that's the answer to any of this. I think we need to find room in the middle where we can approach two sides to some of these issues. For a long time, the church has operated without the learner's interest at necessarily being highlighted, at least in our methodology. And so I don't think that the answer to that is to swing away from truth or away from teaching or even away from cognitive learning. I just think we need a little bit more balance. So when I say strategic shifts for inclusive teaching, I really mean how can we bring the pendulum back a little bit to the middle. So let me just mention a couple of these in the time that I have left. The first thing that I think we might be able to do is shift towards this idea of whole brain teaching. And we have already multiple times in this class and in multiple presentations talked about the way the brain is designed. So I won't go through that idea again here. But what I would say is that the church throughout history has really utilized throughout the agricultural, industrial, information ages, really prioritized and promoted left brain thinking. So that's what we did with 3-point sermons, alliteration, uniform service orders, all of those things. But as Daniel Pink says in his book, A Whole New Mind, we're no longer living in those ages. We're probably now much more in a conceptual age. An age that is characterized by right brain concepts, design, story, symphony, empathy, play, those kind of things. One interesting piece of research that I found was that at the turn of the 20th century, only about 10% of American workers were involved in right brain work. But 100 years later, over 30% were involved in right brain work, being paid for work that involved right brain activity. And what's interesting about that is that move from 10% to 30 did not happen over the full 100 years. It was more like a move of 5% for about the first 90 years or so, and then 25% in the last handful of years. So we're really seeing a trend that more and more Pink was right to say that we're starting to live in an age that is very conceptual. And again, I don't think the answer to this is to move from strictly left brain teaching to right brain. Instead, I think we need whole brain teaching. I think we need teaching that combines logic and the truth of the gospel together with creativity and imagination. So we don't give up logic and truth, but instead we welcome in the artists in our church. We welcome in the creative thinkers, and we start to figure out this idea of imagination. One of the authors that I cited a few times in my paper, Leonard Sweet, is someone that I've had the opportunity over the last few years to get to know. I've been in his home on multiple occasions. And one of the things he says is that the greatest threat to the church is the failure of our God-given imaginations. George MacDonald argues that the Imago Dei shouldn't be thought of as a rational thing, but rather that it's located inside of our imaginations, that the people of God are made in the image of a creative God. And because of that, the church should be consistently involved in the practice of creativity and imagination. So I think it's worth thinking and considering about how we might invest in whole brain learning. And I don't think that means we have to be extreme, or we have to be cliche, or we have to do a movie series or a preaching series on every movie that comes out. Thomas More said, it's my conviction that the slight shift in imagination will have more impact on living than our major efforts at change. So I think for us, it is small shifts. I think as teachers, we look at how can we say old things in new ways. I love the verse at the beginning of Hebrews that says God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. So I just think we need to be looking for ways to bridge the gap between the right brain and the left brain, to be whole brain preachers. And maybe one way that we'll see this, one litmus test that we can use, is just the engagement of right brain people at our church. If you're teaching from a whole brain perspective, then you should probably have both right and left brain people growing in their faith and wanting to be involved. And for a lot of us in our churches, we have a lot more involvement from the cognitive people than we do from the artistic people. And I think we need both of those things. So that's the idea of whole brain teaching. I think another shift we can make is a shift towards cultural exegesis. So I think the preacher who is inclusive in his preaching needs to figure out how not only to be good at exegeting scripture, but also good at exegeting culture. This is what John Stott refers to as bridge building, meaning that we have to bridge the gap between what we have exegeted out of the scripture and also what's going on in our world. If the statistics are anywhere close to being true, that over 60% of people still don't attend church regularly, then it's worth thinking logically that the theology of our world is mostly being formed by music and movies. And I don't think as the church we need to consume or copy that culture. I also don't think we need to stand far away and condemn it. But I love Andy Crouch's idea that we would cultivate this culture, that we'd get our hands dirty in it and try to figure out how to redeem things that are going on. So I think it's our principles, I should say, how to redeem the things that are in our culture and connect them to what God is doing in the world. So if it's true that culture shapes how we view the world and understand God, then I think inclusive teachers have to recognize that there's a lot out in our world that is shaping how people view God, and we need to bring those things together. Another shift that I think we need to make is a shift towards narrative theology, and this idea of narrative theology makes people really nervous. Sometimes at best, people assume that it's an approach where you just use stories and parables. At worst, people think it's an attempt to treat the Bible as fiction, like none of the stories in there really happened. But the way I think about narrative theology is that it's just an attempt to focus on the Bible as a whole, as a dramatic account of God's activity. So you might think about this as not something that's the opposite of, say, systematic theology, but instead something that works together with systematic theology. One way to think about this is like eating an apple versus eating an orange. When we eat an orange, we peel it, we take the pieces apart one at a time, we dissect them, and then we eat them like that. But with an apple, we eat the whole thing. It's all eaten one bite at a time. And I think for a long time, the church has taken this approach that the Bible, that the Christian story is something to be pulled apart, dissected, and then held up one piece at a time, as opposed to the meta-narrative where, like an apple, we would think of it as one whole story. Now, what I would argue is that we need both of those things. I think the church throughout history has been more proficient at dissecting scripture than it has been at embracing the story. But I think we need both of those things to be true. So, for example, in Fowler's stages of faith development, he says that around the age of 13, people enter stage 3, which is where they begin to think abstractly, where they start making connections between unrelated stories as part of a larger narrative. So I think if that's the case, it's worth understanding that people 13 and up have the ability to think of the gospel not as a bunch of disconnected stories, but rather as part of one whole thing. And I think the generation in which we live now is conditioned to value story over proposition. So I think inclusive teaching means that sometimes we pull it apart and hold it up and say, this is what this means. But also we really get back to embracing the whole story and understanding that we are trying to invite people into this overarching drama of the God's redemptive grace and work in the world. So those are some of the learnings that I took away from this. And as I typed my final words and stepped back from this paper, the question that I asked myself is, why does this matter? So what? Like, what did I just give the last few weeks of my life to? And here's the conclusion I've come to. We've been given, as I said at the beginning, this mandate. And the mandate is to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every nation. And those words, all and every, are what really stick out to me. I think that it is our responsibility to honor this commission that we've been given by being good stewards of all the resources placed at our disposal, so that when we present the gospel, when we teach, and when we disciple people, that we are creating ways to disciple that can reach out to all people in every nation. And I think if we ignore this stewardship requirement, we really run the risk of mission drift. Like, we might get a generation from now, and we might have people who no longer feel a burden to reach out to all people who no longer, like our incarnational God, put their arms out wide and say, we want to meet you in the places that you are. But the good news is, I think if we embrace this requirement, then the Great Commission that Jesus gave will be fulfilled. So in that sense, I think inclusive teaching is Great Commission critical. And because of that, I think it deserves the best that we as the church have to offer. So thanks for listening. I'll post some questions online so we can have a good discussion this next week.